Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for a Into the Deep question and answer session. First off, wanted to just give a brief apology. I made the decision to skip kickoff this weekend in favor of seeing my son get married in Austin. I'm still in Austin. I'll be flying home tomorrow. As much as I love FTC, I love my children more. And so that's part of the reason this is a little bit different this year. Basically, this is a question and answer session. And as a caveat to all of the answers you're going to get this evening, these are my opinions. And so the world is very different this year with the way the the competition manual is structured and the way the philosophy of how questions are answered and managed. Just be aware, for all you veteran teams out there, you should kind of pretend you're rookies and you don't know anything. You should assume nothing. You should read everything and read it again and pay a lot of attention to all the resources that are going to be out there. For those who aren't aware, for the last 10, 15 years, I've served as the chief referee for the program. Even for me, in my perspective, I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to deal with answering questions for all the referee community, right? And so there's still a lot of it that we're going to need to learn. So just be patient. It's going to take a while for everybody to get comfortable with the way things work. And the likelihood is, with the amount of edits and changes that were made to the structure and formatting of the competition manual, that there's going to be updates. And speaking of updates, get used to seeing updates come out about every 2 weeks, right? So the current schedule is that there'll be a new update published every other week. That update is the official statement. The game manual is the official source of all truth to how the rules are written and are supposed to be enforced. All the other resources that will be out there, the question and answer and others, are maybe explanatory, but they aren't definitions of things. With that, I'm just going to start going through, reading through questions. I guess first question, it actually is the most recently asked, but I'm going to go ahead and answer it. This call is currently being recorded, and the intention is we will try to share it likely through our YouTube channel. It may take me a couple of days. I will be flying most of tomorrow, so it may take me a day or two to get it up, but we are intending to share the recording of this for the folks that aren't able to make it. And again, the caveat is these answers here are not official answers. They do not represent a truth. They represent what I believe and what I feel, my opinions about how I believe the things are going to work this year. So if you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar system, when you launched the app, there should have been a question and answer kind of box that got created. We're going to try as much as possible to work with typed questions, and I'll read through the questions and we'll try to get an answer to them. I'm just going to start at the top of the list and run through. If I see a duplicate question, I'm likely just going to skip it and keep going down the list in favor of trying to give everybody sort of an equal opportunity. So first question is can human players put clips on during the autonomous period? So what I believe that's referring to is, can the human player work with the materials that are stationed between the field and the Alliance station directly in front of where the human player works and adjacent to the observation zone? If there isn't language in the competition manual that says you can't do that, then yes, you can do that. All the way down to, I believe that the interpretation is the human player could place those elements into the field during the autonomous period, right? So one of the philosophies that, again, I'll talk a little bit about differences between this season and prior seasons. My focus is going to be predominantly on this season, but one of the philosophies is that if the manual doesn't say you can't do something, that you should think that you likely can. Next question up is, are the points scored during an autonomous period counted twice? I'm not sure what the answer to that situation is currently. Historically, the answer was yes. And I don't know that we've settled completely on that. Be patient, wait and see. The actual scoring software itself will come out in an initial version probably in the next week or two. And it's a great opportunity. You can download and play with the scoring software and use it in your practice sessions. And it's a great opportunity to understand how it actually works. Next up, I've got a question that says, can the human player interact with the field? So the human player has field elements during the autonomous period. I think we probably have already answered that one. Next up, we've got a question about yellow cards. Do yellow cards give any point penalties? The yellow card by itself is a warning for very severe behavior, and it is not something that has match point effect. Accumulated yellow cards do turn into red cards, and while they don't have match point effects, they can have ranking point effects. So if you aren't familiar with how the ranking system for match play during qualifying matches works, I would strongly recommend spending some time and reading that section of the game manual. It is important. Effectively, ranking points, the predominant part of the sort order is 2 points for a win, 1 point for a tie, and 0 points for a loss. But if you've gotten a red card in a match or been disqualified from a match, your robot, your team, will not earn any ranking points for the match, even if your alliance wins. So it's good to pay attention to cards. They are intended to help be instructional, to give the alliance, the team, a chance to understand a significant rule violation and improve their gameplay behaviors. Next up is a question about our new horizontal size limit. So one of the things that is true this year is that there is a maximum extension the robot can have during the match. It's important to remember that the robot has to fit within an 18-inch cube in its starting configuration to begin the match, but once the match has begun, it can expand to not exceed a 20 by 42-inch rectangle. That rectangle will be tested during the inspection process, and the easiest way to think about what it means in terms of how it's interpreted is the rectangle and how it's tested during the inspection process becomes fixed with relationship to the body of the robot. And if the rectangle has to move for the extension to remain within the rectangle, move relative to the body of the robot, then that extension is not legal. So for example, if the arm rotates around and that rectangle would have to rotate with the arm to keep it legal, that's not going to end up being something that's going to be allowed and would end up generating consequences. So make sure you read, make sure you pay attention. It is, as an example, if you look in the robot construction section of the game manual, I believe there's more than 2 pages of manual dedicated to just the robot extension rule. So take some time, digest those examples. They've got a bunch of drawings to try to help explain. Make sure you truly understand it, and talk to the inspectors when you get to your first event. Let's see. How many, can we get samples from inside the submersible? Absolutely. The bulk of the samples in the match are going to be placed inside the rectangle that defines the base of the submersible. It is absolutely allowed for the robots to retrieve those. Again, back to the language I used earlier, if something isn't explicitly disallowed, it is allowed. There's nothing that says you can't retrieve them from inside the submersible. There's also nothing that says the robot can't travel inside of the submersible. And so again, keep in mind that slight difference in philosophy. How many expansion hubs can we have in the Rev? How many extensions can we have in the Rev expansion hub? So intention generally with this call was to try to focus predominantly on the gameplay side of things. But within your robot, you may have one control hub and one expansion hub if you're not using an Android phone. If you're using an Android phone, you can have one Android phone, one expansion hub, and a second expansion hub. So it gives the same. So I'm not exactly sure what the extension question was. If you're talking about making the wires longer that you use within the robot, there is no limit to the length of the wires beyond the limits of the size of the robot. You are allowed to fabricate your own wires. You're allowed to use extenders, etc. Can the human player interact with the samples brought into the observation zone by a robot during the autonomous period? Again, if the rules don't say you can't, then you can. So there's nothing that says the humans can't interact with that, I believe. It is one thing you want to make sure is really read through what's going on, what's happening, and just keep that always in mind. Let's see. Can you stack samples above the rim of the baskets? Short answer is yes. There's no, they are subject to the potential of getting dislodged and falling out easily, but there is no constraint that says they can't be. I believe the way the baskets are defined, it is an upward volume that extends, right? So you don't have to be within the closed true volume of the basket. Oh, let's see, what do we got next? Some good questions coming in. I'm trying to keep up with all of them. Are there any benefits beside robot competition practice in attending the super qualifying tournament? So super qualifying tournaments is an option that some regions use to provide an additional layer of competition between the qualifying tournament type events and their regional championship. Here in Northern California, we are not currently using a super qualifier, and so it's not something you'll need to worry about. That may change at some point in the future, but currently we do not have super qualifiers as part of our competition setups. Next up, we have a question that asks, if the robot's range of motion is limited by software, is it valid for the range restrictions even if it is physically able to exceed them? So that is a question that we worked through when we were trying to create the extension limit. The short answer is it is valid, but if something happens and your software limit fails and your robot extends beyond the extension limit footprint, there will be consequences that follow, right? And so just be aware that you need to have some method of limiting, and if those limits fail, even if it's a physical limit, there will be consequences. And next up we've got, is the robot allowed to enter the submersible zone? I think we've already covered that. Next up is a software question. When the SDK supporting Roadrunner will be released for the season. That's a thing you would probably want to take up with the FTC technology folks. There is a separate forum where you can ask great questions and get a whole lot of great answers from them. So that would be something that really isn't something I can cover here. The SDK will get released several times during the season, and usually there's an announcement in the Team Blast for when that's happening. Next up, we have a question about possession of game elements. Are robots allowed to possess, carry clips, and convert samples into specimens, or is the human player the only one allowed to convert samples into specimens? Again, you know, if you stop and think about how things work, the rules in the competition manual don't say that the robot can't carry a large supply of clips, so that sort of implies that yes, you can do that. It might be worth taking a little bit of time to understand how the clips and samples work together to create a specimen before you settle on that as a strategy. It might surprise you how much effort and coordination it takes to make that connection, but there's nothing in the actual competition manual that says you can't do that. Next up, we have a question about ascent. It says, page 65 of the robot says, robot may not initiate contact with the high rung. It's listed as one of the 3 constraints that must be true for ascent. If those 3 aren't all true, it invalidates the ascent. So again, working with simple language, if the manual says something, that's the statement. So with what's there in the manual currently, if your robot initiates a contact with the high rung while in contact with the field surface, that would invalidate an ascent. And so if you're concerned about that, we'd go ahead and recommend asking a question via the Q&A forum, which should open up, I believe, on the 16th, and look for clarifying answers there. If they determine that there needs to be an update to the game manual, there will be an update to the game manual that would clarify that further. Again, no more frequently than once every 2 weeks. When is the robot able to initiate contact with the high rung? Simple answer to that is as soon as the match has begun. contact with the high rung can be initiated if, well, I guess the truth is if the robot wants to fully ascend, in order to be able to qualify for ascent, it cannot contact the high rung until it is no longer in contact with the playing field mats, the surface, right? And so there's a little bit of a limit there. As far as the action of ascending, there is no time limit to when that happens. Historically, the FTC game has had a set of activities that only take place in the final 30 seconds of the match. That is not true in this current game. The act of ascending can be begun at any point in the match. Just got to make sure that you watch out for the sort of sequencing that needs to go on. You're not allowed to make contact, initiate contact with that high rung until the robot is off the playing field floor without invalidating your ascent. Let's see, next up it says, it seems that sponsors cannot be displayed on robot signs. Can they be displayed elsewhere on the robot? Again, back to that language, if the rules don't say you can't do something, then you can. So part of the rationale, I'll talk a little bit about the robot signs. The robot signs are something new this year. It is an effort to try to make robot identification for field personnel and for the other volunteers around the playing field, including game announcers and others, make their job of identifying what robot and what alliance that robot belongs to simpler. So easiest way to think about it is it's effectively like a license plate. Because of the fixed, it has to be exactly a particular size. Because of that fixed size, they do not want to add things into that space that are going to crowd or create visual confusion. So there's a very specific set of things that are allowed in that space on that license plate. Other logos and other things can be in other places on the robot, certainly, but within that license plate, it needs to be constrained to just the elements that are explicitly listed. Next up, we have a question about the number of samples that can be carried. At any point during the teleop period, can we carry 2 samples? So the one sample at a time, one scoring element at a time is the way the rules are written. There is some sort of flexibility, permissivity, forgiveness given for temporary possession of more than one while within the submersible, right? So there is some forgiveness for within that zone. But rest of the field, more than one in a controlled, possessed form is going to end up having consequences. Next up is a related question. Can we push more than one piece at the same time in the submersible, or is that counted as possession of more than one? I think we talked about that briefly. The general understanding of the game is that it is going to be very difficult to be within the submersible and collecting samples from within without affecting adjacent samples. And so there is some forgiveness for pushing, controlling more than one within that space. Again, related question, can we pick up more than one sample specimen at a time? While within the submersible, there's some forgiveness. If it exits the submersible and all other places outside of the submersible, there's no forgiveness. Next up, the question about traveling within the submersible. If the robot travels inside the submersible area, does it count as plowing? Minor penalty every 5 seconds. It does not. Following on to the same conversation, there's some forgiveness within the submersible. Now, of course, if your robot manages to push the samples within the submersible into a way that looks like it's attempting to shield them from the opposing alliance, there are consequences associated with that, right? It's shutting down major aspects of the gameplay and would end up causing fouls to be accumulated. Next up, we have what happens if you score a sample of the opposing alliance color. Control of the opposing alliance samples is a rule violation, would generate fouls or major fouls, I don't remember which, for that control possession. Next up, we have, can we touch the bars when picking samples from inside the submersible? Aside from, there's 2 different classes of bars. There's the bars that are intended to be used for climbing. We call them rungs. So there's 2 places for those. And then we've also got a couple of bars that are colored on the ends. We call those chambers. There's no rule that says you can't touch them. There is a rule that says if you initiate contact with the high rung prior to leaving the playing field surface, that you would invalidate your ascent. But other than that, there's no rule that says you can't make contact with them. Next up, we've got a question again about human players and clips during the autonomous period. And again, read the manual literally. There are no hidden constraints. The manual is supposed to be black and white and read as written. And so if it doesn't say you can't do something, then you can't. So there's nothing currently in the manual that says that the human player can't manipulate the clips and samples that are in the area between the playing field and the alliance station. It also doesn't say that they can't collect samples from the observation zone. It also doesn't say that they can't place specimens or samples or clips into the observation zone. Right? So all of those things, because they weren't disallowed, are effectively allowed. Next up, we have, if Alliance robot gets disabled in the observation area, can the human player still reach in to pick samples to make specimens? There's an explicit statement in the protections for the observation zone that talks about the disabled robots not causing the area to be unusable. The caveat there is if you become disabled in the opposing alliance's observation zone, you're going to accumulate penalties on a pretty high basis. Right? So there are no protections for disabled robots in this year's game. If your robot dies in an unfortunate position and is earning penalties, those penalties will continue to accumulate based on the particular rule for the remainder of the match, for as long as the rule violation persists. Next up, we have, do we have to be inside or outside the ascent zone during the end game? I guess I don't completely understand the question. The ascent zone provides protections during, again, there's no end game. So that's a term that doesn't exist in the current competition manual. So no end game, there's only the final 30 seconds. The ascent zone itself doesn't have any special definition until the final 30 seconds. In the final 30 seconds, there are some ascent protections that come into play that cover contact between opposing alliance robots. So if a red robot is in its ascent zone and a blue robot makes contact with it while both have any part in that zone, that will generate a foul, major foul, depending upon the exact rule. I don't remember exactly what. There is no requirement that you be in the ascent zone to begin ascending, but it sort of makes sense that you might want to be. It is roughly, I think, 12, 16 inches between the rungs and the sort of outriggers that support the submersible. So it's likely, and if you aren't in that zone, you're not going to have those protections. There is an explicit rule that says that you can't climb from inside the submersible. So ascents must be initiated from outside of the submersible, not inside the submersible. Basically, we determined that the too much probability of robots interfering with each other inside the basically 2-foot zone inside the submersible. And so you're not allowed to start your climb from inside the submersible. You have to be outside the submersible. Let's see next. No, wow, that's a long question. For parking in autonomous, can you only park in the observation zone or can you park in the net zone? Read the rule, read the scoring description literally. You park where it says. It's not an or, not an and. There is exactly a defined set of places. That is the literal set. Let's see, here's a related question. So please, for simplicity, if you could try to limit one question per your entry. The text gets very hard to read when you type a whole bunch of questions all in one box. There's no formatting and it makes it really difficult to read. So please limit to one question per entry, basically. Let's see. Next up is, how many samples fit in the basket? I actually don't know how many samples fit in one of the baskets. And so that's an interesting question. When you get your set, give it a test. When I get back and start doing the field walkthroughs Wednesday night, I can run a test and we can get an idea. Some of it may depend upon how neatly they're placed. So if they're sort of randomly placed, they're probably not going to fit as many as if they were sort of nested and stacked. But I actually don't know the answer to that. Question, let's see, can robots possess clips, not specimens? The answer is yes, they can, and there's no limit on how many they're allowed to possess, because it's, the possession rule specifically talks about samples and specimens. It does not talk about clips. Are we allowed to touch the low rung when ascending? So it's good to read what the conditions are for ascending. So there is talk about what you are supported by as you're ascending, right? So there's the lowest level. There's a level 2, it's a level 1 ascent, a level 2 ascent, and a level 3 ascent. Each have a description of what is required. Level 1 ascent is you can be on the playing field surface and you're just in contact with the lowest bar. Level 2 ascent says I'm in contact with that second bar and I'm off the playing field surface. Level 3 ascent says I am supported only by the highest bar and I am above the middle bar. And so there's constraints to each of them. So just be aware. Contact is not the definition, it's support that is the definition. And then there's some above and below kind of constraints. Next up, we have a question. Can the human player pick up samples and keep them outside the observation area, outside of the field, and introduce them one at a time as a specimen? Again, this is the same language. If the rules don't say you can't do something, then you can. So the samples that are delivered to the observation zone are the human players to manage. The assumption is that the human player is going to pick up the samples and then attach a clip to them to turn them into a specimen and then return them. There's no timeliness described or no requirement to do it with any sort of true speed. Let's see, how to reach the FTC Technology Forum. Easiest way to find the link to it is to go to the team resources, the game and season resources on the First Inspires website for First Tech Challenge. If you're not familiar with that section of the First Inspires website, it's worth spending a little bit of time looking at all the pieces. There's links to all the game materials. There's links to the field drawings, the field setup manuals. There's links to the ordering resources through AndyMark for ordering fields and game elements. There's links to technology resources. And so you really want to make sure that you spend a little bit of time and truly understand that section of the website. But that'll be the easiest place to find a link to the FTC Technology Forum. Let's see. Next up, we have a question. If a specimen that's hung on the wall falls into the observation area, can the human player pick it back up and hang it again? Again, same answer. Everything that's in the observation zone can be retrieved and managed by the human player. The competition manual doesn't say you can't do that, so therefore you can. Let's see. Next up, we have, where does the robot have to start? Just along our alliance wall anywhere? Short answer is that's basically the statement. There must be contact with the playing field wall to the alliance station for the alliance. Next up, we have, if the robot initiates contact with the high rung while not fully supported by the low rung, is the robot still eligible for a level 2 ascent? With the language that is currently explicitly written in the game on the competition manual, no. That ascent is not valid. Again, expect lots of questions about that one in the Q&A. We'll see what the updates hold or not. In the game manual, what does it mean by let the robots do its thing in autonomous? So you've got to watch out for reading too much into the little colloquial language that sort of leads into each rule. The let the robots do its things mean you can't provide any sort of input or control to the robot during the autonomous period, except for you are allowed this year to press the stop button to end your robot's autonomous routine at any point during Once you've pressed that stop button, though, the robot is effectively disabled, not exactly disabled under the way the rules are written, but effectively no longer operational for the remainder of the autonomous period. It is, however, allowed to continue for the driver control period. Sorry, it's now called the teleop period. Let's see. Next up, we have, if game elements are pushed out of the submersible zone, can they be picked up and scored? There's nothing in the rules that say that it isn't allowed, right? So again, the rules don't say you can't do that. That effectively means you can. The one thing to watch out for with that as a base strategy is if more than one is pushed out at a time, that's likely not going to be forgiven by the within the submersible exception for the possession limit. So just be aware, if you push them out one at a time, yeah, they can be picked up and scored. Recognize, though, that they can be picked up and scored by any robot on the playing field. If a sample falls outside the field boundaries during an attempt to score at the baskets, is anyone allowed to reintroduce the sample to the field? The short answer is no. Game elements that leave the playing field do not get returned this year. Can you please give more detailed instructions on how many sample specimens can be possessed at once? A robot may possess no more than one sample or specimen. So it means if they have a sample, they can't pick up another sample. They can't pick up another specimen. If they have a specimen, they can't pick up another specimen, and they can't pick up another sample. No more than one at any time during the match. How will referees judge when the robot is no longer supported by any object other than the low rung while attempting a level 3 ascent? So one of the truths of having humans around the playing field judging robot activities is it is going to be challenging for some things if they're not made obvious and unambiguous. And so it's to your team's advantage to try to make it very clear that you are abiding by the constraints of ascending, right? So general guidance to the referees is always going to be, if it's too close to tell, we will probably err on the side of supporting the teams, right? But you really want to try to make sure that you're not forcing referees to make decisions. The better you do at making it obvious and unambiguous, the more likely you're going to get a consistent answer. There's not a strict metric for how far, how high, how long. It just needs to be clear and unambiguous that it's not supported before engage that top rung. We have a sort of generally a little bit vague question. If a robot inside the submersible interferes with robot arms picking up pieces, is that a penalty? The short answer is there's no way from that question to really give you a definitive answer. Referees are going to watch and see what the interaction looked like. So it could be a penalty, it might not be a penalty. And actually we generally call them fouls this year. So that is one that the referees are going to have to watch and see as an example of the dynamic that's going on between those two robots. Let's see, next up we have, does rolling the sample on the floor count as launching? Would this be legal? So that causing the sample to move with that kind of a velocity is likely going to be considered launching. Right? If you read the way the launching descriptions works, the forgiveness that's given there is about an intake mechanism. So if your intake mechanism is disgorging excess elements, like for example, within the submersible, that's likely going to be forgiven. But if there is a launching in a method that looks like you're attempting to move a particular element to a particular place, that's likely going to end up getting the attention of the referees and is likely going to be considered launching, regardless of whether or not it's sliding or rolling. And remember, these are rectangular solids effectively, so that they roll kind of abruptly, likely wouldn't roll for very far. Can we find most answers that are provided in the manual? I guess I don't completely understand that. The game manual, the competition manual, is the sort of source of truth for things. That is the definition of how things are supposed to be interpreted. There's no hidden meaning behind things. When there's ambiguity, teams will ask questions in the Q&A. If the ambiguity generates a desire to update the rules from the game design side, then a game manual update will provide the clarifications in an effort to provide that. But that game manual is the definition, right? There is no superseding, no overriding. It's one of the pieces that's different this year, but the game manual itself provides the definition. Can we go into the ascent zone even before endgame? Absolutely. The ascent zone does not have a limit to when it can be entered. It has a time frame when there are some special protections provided for activities within the ascent zone, i.e. last 30 seconds of the match. Is the human player allowed to assemble specimens outside of the vertical plane created by the playing field perimeter? Absolutely. That is the expectation, right? From a safety perspective, we kind of would prefer that the human players do the minimum amount of extension into the field they need to do their job for the minimum amount of time required to do that job. But, get in, get out. If the robot is touching the level 2 bar when hanging on the level for level 3, does that count as a level 2 or level 3? It's good to read the definition of what a level 3 ascent is. So in order for it to be a level 3 ascent, the robot needs to be completely above the level 2 bar, right? So that would be a level 2 ascent, then not a level 3 ascent. Let's see, how long can the robot be inside the submersible zone? No more than 2 minutes and 30 seconds, because the match will be over at the end of that 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But beyond that, there is no time limit. There is the potential, though, for a risk if your robot stays inside the submersible zone during the last 30 seconds and make contact with a robot that's in its own ascent zone during that last 30 seconds, right? So the expectation is that once the robots start ascending, they're going to start to swing a little bit to within the submersible zone. So being inside that zone carries risks. It's up to you, your team, to decide how they wish to manage that risk, but there are risks. Are specimens and samples scored during the autonomous period counted again at the end of the game for points? I believe the answer is probably yes. This is one that's been gone back and forth. Wait for the scoring system to come out and look at the behavior of the scoring system. That will be the easiest way to verify. I believe the first release of the scoring system is supposed to be in the next, if it hasn't been released already, it likely will be in the next, within the next week. If the robot is touching the level 2 bar when hanging on level 3, does that count as a level 2 or 3? I think we just talked about that one, so I'm going to skip. Would controlling the opposing alliance's sample inside the submersible be considered a penalty? Maybe. Depends on how long. Is it sort of a momentary while you're disgorging? Are you sorting? Right. So it's one of those that has to be watched. If it looks like you're attempting to collect them all and purposefully put them in a place that makes it harder for the opposing alliance to collect them, that's likely going to get attention based under that don't shut down major aspects of gameplay. Are we allowed to have a part of our robot overhang into the submersible where the samples will lie? All 4 wheels will be outside the submersible, but a part of the robot may be hanging over. I'm assuming this is a question about ascent, and it sort of follows from that some of the discussion I had a moment ago. Expectation is the robots are going to swing to be somewhat within the submersible zone during the ascent action. Right? It's somewhat impossible not to, based on the physics of hanging. Next up, we have a question about human player and interaction with the samples that are in the basket. Can the human player take them out of the basket? Short answer is no. Nobody will remove the samples from the baskets until the match is completed, at which point they'll be reset back into the playing field. In order for the human player to reach into to grab those samples, they actually would have to violate a couple of different rules and would likely end up getting some significant fouls. Next up we have, so when ascending, we have to first get off the ground from the low rung and then pull ourselves up to the higher rung. That is the intention of the way the ascent rules are written. That is effectively a sort of a sequential climb. Leave the playing field surface before attempting to reach to the top. my questions. I just lost where I was in my questions. Sometimes the GoToWebinar app is not the most friendly. Been some good questions so far. Hopefully everybody's taking time to read the manual. Here we go. Can we pick up a sample and a specimen at the same time? I'm going to answer that from the perspective of you're asking about, can a robot do that? The answer is no. They may possess one sample or one specimen, not one of each, and not more than one of each. Can the specimen be hung on the playing field wall in the observation area? Yes. If we have more questions in the future, whom should we reach out to for clarification? There is a question and answer system that's been set up for teams to be able to ask questions. There is a description in the game manual that talks about how your lead coach 1, lead coach 2 can retrieve the credentials that are needed to set up a team account to be able to ask questions. And there's also a description in that game and season resources page that I talked about earlier as well. But that is a place to ask clarifying questions. And there's some suggestions on how to word your questions to be most effective included in the game manual. Again, a possession question says, per G410, it says a robot may not control more than one sample or one specimen at a time. It doesn't say you can control one of each. It says you can't have more than one of either. Right? So it's one specimen, one sample, not one of each. Next question is can you ascend multiple times? There is no limit to the number of times you can ascend. Your ascending action can only be scored once. If you read the description of how the ascent is scored, there's a 3-second sound that occurs at the end of the match. If at the end of that 3 seconds, the robot is meeting the ascent criteria for a level 1, 2, or 3 ascent, that's when that is finalized. All the actions that happen before that are somewhat irrelevant. It's that last, where is the robot at the end of that 3-second buzzer, basically. So you can ascend multiple times, but you can't score ascent more than once. See, does the team still earn points if the basket is overflowing and only a small part of the sample is in the basket? If any part of the sample is in the basket, it is in the basket. Right? It's not about all, it's not completely, it's not within. Any part in counts as in. Can you provide more clarification on not leaving the floor mat during the ascent? Does that mean you may not touch the floor mat after ascent? Just telling you that if you've initiated contact with the high rung prior to leaving the playing field surface, it will not count as a valid ascent. And so you want to make sure that that's something you pay attention to. This is probably the most ambiguously worded aspect of the current rules. I'm sure each of you who have asked similar questions are not alone, and I expect there'll be several questions asked during the team Q&A portion on the web. And so watch the game manual, watch for updates or clarifications via the Q&A. Next up we have, can you do a level 1 ascent during autonomous? Yes, you can, right? So level ascent basically just means making contact with that low bar. And it is one of the autonomous scoring actions. And so that is something that is allowed. Next up, if you do the level 1 during autonomous, can you still do a level 3 during teleop? Of course. They are not mutually exclusive. Once you've done the level 1 does not mean you cannot do the level 3 at the end of the match. Let's see. Lost my spot in my questions again. Almost caught up to all of you. One of the challenges with not being at home is normally when I do this kind of a call at home, I have 3 screens to work with. While traveling, I did not bring my 3 screens, and so I'm trying to do this all with just 1 screen. So it's taking me a little bit longer than I'd like. Let's see. See, how lenient are they with the human player clipping the specimen to the wall in the observation area? There is no need for leniency as long as the human player doesn't cause the specimen to exit the observation zone and doesn't violate any other rules. There's no constraint on how, when, where they clip those onto the playing field wall. So there's no real leniency required. If you're allowed to start auto late, are you allowed to start auto late if we can also stop auto now? Short answer is no. There is an explicit rule that says you must start on time. If you violate that rule, there will be fouls assigned accordingly. So the expectation is everybody starts on time. You got to start when the 3, 2, 1 go fires, but you can stop before the whole 30 seconds is consumed. Another question about an assent getting invalidated by not meeting all the constraints. There is no provision right now. The language in the manual is pretty straightforward. If you initiate contact while in contact with the playing field surface, the assent is invalidated. And so there is no current provision for reattempting the assent. And so all I can say is watch for questions in the Q&A and watch for potential updates in the competition manual. Next up, we have a question: how many samples can be in the observation zone at a time? Beyond the mechanical limit of the number of samples in the match, there is no limit. So if your alliance wants to take all of its samples and take them over to your observation zone and place them there as a primary activity, there's nothing that would prevent you. The caveat is they don't actually earn any points being in the observation zone. You need to get them somewhere else, either into one of the net or into the basket. Right, so they are the fundamental places. Next up, we have another human player question. After the human player clips the hook onto the sample, can the human player interact with the specimen again? With the way the current rules are written, all of the specimens and samples and clips that are either in between the human player in the alliance station and the playing field or within the observation zone are all fair game for the human player to manipulate, as long as they don't violate any other rules. Next up, we have a question that says, can the human player pick up more than 1 sample at a time? Short answer is, again, there's nothing in the manual that says you can't, so therefore you can. So if the human player wants to reach in and pick up 2 at a time, go for it. There's nothing that says they can't do that. Next question is basically a duplicate of the couple of previous ones. Can there be multiple sample specimens in the observation zone? And can the human player handle more than 1 at a time? Short answer to both is yes. Where does the robot start in autonomous? Can it be on any tile touching the wall? I believe the answer is yes. There may be constraints about the observation zone and the net zone. I'm not 100% certain. Again, some of these things get changed pretty dynamically as the game's getting developed. Read the match setup section for further clarification. If it doesn't give you specific can't be in a space, again, you can be, right? The game manual doesn't say you can't do something, you can. Next up, we say, how do you tell where the box for the horizontal limit is? Like how big it is? So this is going to be one of the things that will be very challenging for our referees. They're going to have to figure out a couple of different metrics to use. So if you look at the playing field surface, it's broken into 2-foot square tiles. So any extension that covers more than 2 tiles in width, more than 1 tile in width, is obviously beyond 20 inches. That's going to be relatively easy for the referees to determine. The 42 inches gets a little bit tougher because that's just a little bit under 2 tiles in length. So the referees are going to have to be spending some time coming up with a metric for that. That's not something that's been figured out completely yet. But remember that bounding box for that extension stays fixed relative to the core of the robot, right? If the box has to move to make the extension legal, the extension has violated the extension limit rule. Next up, we have a repeat question. Can you ascend multiple times? Nope. The ascent is judged based on the status of the robot at the after 3 seconds have expired. Once the match timer gets to 0, easiest way to recognize that is when the buzzer sound at the end of the match ends. So if your robot meets an ascent criteria status for scoring, when that buzzer goes silent again, it will earn points. Otherwise, it will not. So the similarly worded question, so for the points for ascent to be counted, you need to be off the ground in the last 3 seconds specifically. It's not in the last 3 seconds, it's at the end of the last 3 seconds, right? The status of the robot will be judged when the 3 seconds expires. So time ends, humans ideally stop driving the robot, 3 seconds runs. If the robot still meets the ascent criteria at the end of that 3 seconds, the ascent points are earned. Another, what is the max amount of specimen samples in the observation zone? Fundamental limit of just the number of elements that are in the match. I believe it's 20 alliance specific for each alliance and 40 alliance neutral. So that kind of gives you a limit. So the theoretical maximum would be 80 if all the both alliances and all the neutrals were in that zone. But beyond that, there's no express limit from a gameplay perspective. And I think we're starting to get a duplicate questions. Are we allowed to have a specimen or a robot at the end of the autonomous period? There's nothing in the rule in the competition manual that says you can't, so you can. Can we touch any other part of the submersible when hanging on the high rung? The contact is not the issue, support is the issue. And if you're worried about whether or not it's going to be judged as support, you may want to try to figure out how to ascend a little bit more cleanly so that you don't have a risk of needing to make a referee to make a judgment call, right? So kind of pay attention to that. I used the phrase obvious and unambiguous before. That's the one you want to sort of think about. Are we able to hang park? Before the end of the autonomous period for points? When the autonomous period ends, the referees are going to look at the status of the robot to determine the sort of parking aspects. And so the level 1 ascent is basically one of a couple of places the robot can effectively park. And so it's at the end of the autonomous period. Is the robot in contact with that low rung? If yes, it'll get the ascent points. If no, it won't get those ascent points. It isn't a touch the low rung and then go off and do other things and expect to get the ascent points. It has to be there at the end of the autonomous period. Next, we have what happens with the samples outside the field. I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. There are a couple of samples that will start outside, right? The Alliance, when it's getting set up, has the option of preloading samples, either neutral or Alliance specific. And the ones that don't get preloaded stay outside the playing field for the human player to use. If during the match a robot causes a sample or a specimen to exit the field, that sample or specimen stays out of the field. It does not get returned to the field. Oh, let's see. Samples in the submersible at the beginning of the match can be stacked or standing up. There is no defined orientation or status for the samples. They will be somewhat randomly placed within the submersible. So it would be prudent to expect a lot of variability in terms of how they're oriented and how they stand. It's not defined beyond that. Just there will be a supply there. Next up, we have our samples counted at the end of the autonomous period and at the end of the game. I believe the answer is yes. So effectively, if samples scored during the autonomous period effectively end up counting twice. Easiest way to verify that is to get a hold of the scoring system when it's released and play around with it, have fun. Can the human player put clips onto the specimen in auto? Human player can put clips onto samples during the autonomous period to create a specimen. You can also then add more clips to that specimen, but adding more clips doesn't make it any better. But yes, the human player can manipulate the game pieces during the autonomous period, including placing them back into the field for the robots to manipulate and score. Can we create a tool to aid the human player to attach clips to the samples? The short answer is no. There's a rule that's titled something to the effect of you can't bring anything you want to the playing field. And so tools that manipulate scoring elements are one of the things that you are not allowed to bring. Next up, we have a question that says, is it okay to hit our Alliance's robot during autonomous, or is there a penalty? I'm going to answer that in two ways. Hopefully it covers what the question is, because the question's a little bit vaguely worded. So a human hitting the robot would be a big problem. That's going to end up generating a yellow card for the human players alliance. A robot hitting a robot during the autonomous period, if it's the same alliance, there's no consequence. If it's an opposing alliance, we need to look at where that contact occurred. One of the two robots is going to get a consequence based on having crossed into the opposing alliance's half of the field, right? That would be the autonomous interference kind of a rule. With that, I think I've actually caught up with all the current questions. It's been very interesting to try to keep up with all of the questions coming. I guess the biggest advice I would have for everybody is don't assume anything, right? I've been talking over the last month and a half, 2 months with a lot of the referee community, and that's basically been the message I've been telling all of them. Assume nothing, read everything. There are a lot of differences to how things work this year. So even my veteran referees are going to have to spend a lot of time relearning how things work. If you're a returning team, it would be dangerous to assume that you can do things just like you did last year. Really think of yourself as a rookie. Take the time to read through all of the material in the competition manual and really sort of accumulate that as a good source of knowledge. Right? Don't assume anything. Ask lots of questions. There will be monthly gameplay calls, so you'll have an opportunity to have a call similar to this. Come get on a webinar, ask a lot of questions, get some clarification on how things work. You can use the team Q&A to ask questions via the web at any point, and just take advantage of those resources and help your team be as successful as it can be. Okay, if there aren't other questions, I will allow everyone to get a couple of minutes back in your evening. I anticipated this taking about an hour, and so that's about where we are at this point. Enjoy the game, enjoy the season. Make sure you take the time to read the manuals. Next up for all of our teams in this area is going to be starting to get yourselves prepared and ready for the season. We will be holding a sort of a season kickoff town hall meeting on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. Make sure you have a representative to dial in there. We will be talking at some length about what teams should expect as the season continues to evolve. So deadlines, timing for things, what the current status of everything is. So you really, pardon me, really want to make sure that you're connected to that and engaged with keeping up. With that, I did have a couple of our seasoned head referees join for sort of backup support if needed. So Jeff Green joined and William Chan joined. So you'll probably see some of them at your events this season. But you know, have fun with the game and enjoy Into the Deep. With that, I'm going to end the webinar and we'll bid you all a good night.